Welcome, builders, to our second tech training on an intro to automation. That's my goal in this training, is to introduce the idea of automations to you, show you softwares that allow you to automate things, and then hopefully help you build an automation for your own self that will increase the leverage of your actions. That's what automations at the end of the day really do, is they help you increase the number of things that happen when you click a button, when you write a document, when you post on social media, when you do something in QuickBooks, right? You increase the number of actions that are taken by software on your behalf by creating automations for yourself. So that's the goal then of these automations, is to increase the leverage of your actions. And whether that be you don't have to make the decision as often, so an automation that runs for you on a weekly or daily basis, whether that be the automation happens when you go live on Twitch, which is what I do, for example. I post on Twitter and different Reddit subreddits when I go live on Twitch based on the topic that I'm streaming on that day. So I have different automations to broadcast and disseminate information when I go live on Twitch. And we're going to dive into today specifically when you can make an automation work for you. And then second, know roughly how to make it happen. So without further ado, we're just going to hop in here. I'm going to share my screen. And so for me in particular, this presentation, again, the goal is to help you see when you can make automations in your own life to increase your leverage. And second, to know how to make it happen, right? And so our goal at the end of this is that you can see different parts of your life that can be automated and also know roughly how to make that happen, or at least perhaps the steps that you might go through to execute that. So a sneak peek then at your future power is, for example, publish to every social media platform when you go live on Twitch or on YouTube, etc. Right? You can capture these events and publish everywhere. You can automatically send messages in Discord or Slack when you post on social media. You can send an email or text message to subscribers when you publish some fire content. You can also publish articles automatically from Google Docs, which is something I've set up as well. I just drag a Google Doc into a folder and it publishes it straight to Medium for me. It's fetching awesome. Absolutely love it. So that is just your future power. That's what you're going to be able to do, hopefully by the end of this, right? So we got the steps, right? So step number one is we're going to take a look at what I call triggers. And these are basically, when this happens, we do X. Then we're going to look at sources. Sources are, where is your information coming from, right? Sometimes our triggers are very simplistic. Sometimes our triggers get our sources get more complex. So simple sources might be the same thing that triggered is the same thing that has the source of information. If we're leveraging AI, for example, our source might be that AI. We're going to feed it a prompt. It's going to generate something for us, and we're going to use that information that it gave back to us. So that'll be a source. Second, we got our targets. So we're going to do these first three things first. It's like I'm just going to cruise through those first three in this presentation rather quickly. I'll give you examples as we're going through. And so I'll be hopping in and out of the presentation to show you different zaps that I personally have created. So next, we're going to find our automator. So not all automation softwares are created equal. There's pros to Zapier, there's pros to Make, and there are other automation softwares as well that you can leverage. I won't dive into those. My focus today will be mostly on Zapier and Make, as those are the ones I am most familiar with personally. But we need to find and do some research. Once we know our triggers, sources, and targets, we need to do some research to determine, okay, which software will best serve us. Because Make can do some things that Zapier cannot. It's got specific integrations that Zapier doesn't. and vice versa. Next, once we found our automator, we've determined where we're going to build, we're going to actually build it, test it. And lastly, we're going to give it a name, which is actually a lot more important than you would think. And I have a specific process that I go through to actually name my automations. So 1, I don't lose them. 2, they're organized. 3, I can get a pretty good idea of what they do just by looking at them. So let's say you make an automation, 6 months go by, you come back, maybe you have to tweak it, update it, something, and you don't know which automation it is. So as we add more automations to our life, we need to have good naming, good organization, so that we don't lose track of these automations that are improving our life. And especially as things get more complex. So for example, if we have an automation that is triggering another automation, being able to see that relationship is going to be very important. And the way that I name things generally gives us that ability to see the relationship. So that's what we're tackling first, or this is actually the agenda for today. And the first 3 things we're going to tackle are triggers, sources, and targets. So we got triggers. Basically, this is a when this happens, right? That's what we're looking at, when this happens. And we're just going to go and take a look at a couple of different examples, right? So I call the trigger the when this happens because for every automation, you're only going to have one trigger. And it could be when you click this button, when you post content, when you go live, right? A trigger can be anytime you're really interacting with software. When you create a Google Doc, when you put a Google document in a specific folder, could be a trigger as well. It's just when this happens, that's our trigger. Let's go and take a look at a couple of examples. Just using the Google Doc example, I have this Zap set up so that when I have a new published document inside of a specific folder called published, this Zap is going to trigger. And so that's the trigger. And I hope that that idea makes sense to you. Just when this happens, ... That's your trigger. If you can state it in English in that way, you'll be able to identify what your trigger is, where your automation point starts. And I want you to get really good at identifying these triggers in your life, because that will help you know and see really when you can automate a process. So if there's, for example, something that you're doing repeatedly, just over and over again, and you can easily say, when this happens, I need to do X, right? And if that's a work-related process, for those of you who are involved in creating lots of content, when I post on TikTok, for example, I need to do X. When I post on YouTube, I need to do X. For me, it's when I go live on Twitch, I want to do X, Y, Z. Let's go take a look at that trigger, for example. So this is a Twitch go live. So that's my trigger. I've got my new Zadaka live stream, and then I've got a whole bunch of things that I do based on that stream, right? So this is when this happens. When Sterling goes live on Twitch, we're going to start our automation. So get really good at identifying those trigger points. It's like when I'm doing something, and this is generally, I will say, you're interacting with software in some way. You're clicking a button, you're dragging a file. There's something that you did that you can respond to with the automation. So once we've got our trigger, once we have identified our trigger, our next step is going to be sources. And sources are just use this information, right? And commonly, our source is our trigger. And for most of the automations, our source will actually be our trigger. And so what I mean by that is that the trigger includes all the information that we need to perform our actions. So example, in this new Lazadica live stream, it triggers, and this is my source as well. I'm sending a message in Discord, and I'm using different pieces of information from this live stream. So I'm using the title and the link to my Twitch page. when I send this message, I call these our information that came from this source that was Twitch. This step has information associated with it that is passed down to future steps. And I'm leveraging that information, that source of information, in my future steps. So I send a community post, I make a decision. So that's what this path is. This is a pretty complicated zap. If it looks confusing, don't worry. We'll begin to break it down perhaps a little bit later. I'm not sure I'm going to dive into logic quite yet. I expect most of your automations to actually look more like this one, where it's just rule locks. You just have like a two-step process. You got a trigger, and then you have a do a thing, right? Maybe you're doing 2 things or 3 things, but you got a trigger, do the thing. So in this case, when I publish a new document, this new document, it comes with all the text from that Google Doc. That's my source of information. And I take that source of information, I say, publish it on Medium. Take the raw file in HTML format and publish a Medium article for that on my behalf. When I just drag and drop it in here. This Google Doc then is my source of information. Going back to this idea of AI, let's say, for example, I wanted the AI to come up with a really intriguing title for me. Instead of me having a title in here, I do pull the title from the document itself. But let's say I wanted the AI as well to post something on Twitter and just take my published document, boil it down to its perhaps some main points, and then post that on Twitter. I would consider that AI, the generated values, generated content from that AI, I would consider that a source as well. For example, if I publish new content, I can add another step in here. Let's say I want to work with ChatGPT. And so we're going to choose an event. We're going to summarize text, enter a block of text and generate a summary. We're going to continue. I've already linked up my account, so we're good to go there. And I can tack in raw file plain text context. So I can just put all my files, this previous source of information, the Google Doc, I can take all of its text and put it into the text to be summarized. I choose the model, I choose the max number of tokens. I probably increase this. I'm not going to actually save this. You can change these different values for ChatGPT itself. And then I just hit continue, right? We can hit test step. I'm curious to see how it does with only 2048 tokens. It might not be super happy with that. But let's see, so what did it give me? So it gave me the summary. The user talks about the concept of precious and how it relates to their life after having a daughter. Yeah. I could use this and post this on Twitter. I'd likely want to increase the value that was provided in here and tweak this up quite a bit so that it's more potentially in my voice, is a bit cleaner for a Twitter post or LinkedIn post, etc. But this is something that I can do, right? And then I've thought about it, I'm actually probably gonna give this a shot and see how it goes. Just test it for a couple of weeks and see if it works. But this is an example of a source, right? I've generated a new piece of information that I can now use. So just continuing the example, if I go to Buffer, I'm using Buffer to publish on different social medias, by the way. So I add to a queue. This is my account. I'm going to choose a channel, and let's say I'm just going to post to Twitter. So Lazadic along Twitter. The text will be the summarized text in ChatGPT. So this is my summarized text, since the summary, sorry, I want the summary. The user talks about the concept of precious. So the summary from ChatGPT, and we're going to choose the media, which is no attachment. If I wanted to generate an image using a different AI and then feed that into here as well, I could do that. I'm not going to walk through that process. I haven't found a really clean way to do it yet, or I haven't found an AI that makes nice images that I can call from Zapier yet. But it is possible. I have done it. And so the method is, instead of adding to queue, I'm just gonna share now. And so that's how we would generate a new source of information and then feed that source of information into another target, which leads us into our third thing, which is targets. Do this thing, right? We want to do something on some platform somewhere. For example, in this case, it's like I want to publish on Medium, I want to summarize it, and then I want to slap this bad boy straight into Twitter, LinkedIn, different places. If I wanted to generate an image and then also put it on Instagram, I could do that, right? And so we have this ability to identify, well, once we've identified our triggers, when this happens, our sources use this information. So the source here being this Google Doc plus what I summarized using ChatGPT. And then we're going to identify our targets, the places we want to execute some kind of specific action. That's what I call a target. So publish on Medium, very specific action. Publish on Twitter, very specific action. Those are our targets, I would say. Medium and Twitter are our targets. We're leveraging the information in our sources and sending out information or executing an action on our targets with the information that we have. In this case, I'm publishing with the summary and with the complete document from Google Docs. And so those are triggers, sources, targets, right? So we need to get good at, let's say you need to get good at identifying your triggers, identifying where your information is coming from, and then identifying where you want to put it. If you have all those three things, if you have those three things in a row, you are set. You can make an automation. You can automate the thing. I promise you. You can find something that will do it for you so you don't have to. And I fetching love doing that. I absolutely love doing that. Our next step then, taking a look at this, we need to find your automator, right? And this step is basically, I was talking about this previously, different softwares have different strengths, pros, and cons. The two softwares I'll present to you for automating things are Make and Zapier. I personally prefer Zapier because it has a couple of features that I really like. I didn't used to prefer Zapier. I used to prefer Make, and then Zapier got some really nice updates. And now I'm like, all right, Zapier is, the bomb.com. And I'll tell you why I think Zapier is the bomb.com. Specifically, one is versioning. So Zapier recently, in the past year, introduced this idea of versioning. So it used to be that when you were, let's say, if I was messing with this Zap a year ago, and I made some changes, the Zap would have turned off, which is a huge, massive no-no. If it's a really important automation that's being called hundreds, thousands of times. And right, I was building automations for enterprises, and there were hundreds to thousands of automations happening. And if the automation turned off, it was like I was screwed. I needed to turn it off, turn it back on as fast as I possibly could. And then it ended up getting to the point where I would duplicate a Zap so that it wouldn't turn off. And then I would turn on the new one, turn off the old one so there was no downtime. So Zapier, they fixed that. And I fetching love it because now I can create drafts. And so right now, this is a draft, right? If I go like draft saved 4 minutes ago, if I go back, this is the Zap that's actually published. And so this is why I really love Zapiers, because they have this version. But looking into finding your automator, the main reason that you would really want to look at different automators is because different automators have different tools that are integrated. So let me give you one example of that. I know Zapier recently removed the ability to interact with Twitter. So this was actually really brutal for me because I started using Zapier, and then the next day, they got rid of the ability to interact with Twitter. So I can't detect things on Twitter. I can't publish things on Twitter directly. That's why I'm using Buffer. I found that Buffer let me kind of, as a middleman, let me publish to Twitter. And so, I was able to find a workaround, but Make still has the ability to interact with Twitter. And that is really, really nice and will be incredibly valuable for a lot of people. So you want to find the automator that works best for you. And there's multiple variables that go into this. So I didn't write them down, but one of the variables is just cost. Zapier and Make have different costs. And for example, if we're using Twitter on Make, you're going to have to pay for the Twitter API, which is $100 a month, which is why I looked for a different solution and ended up using Buffer, which does actually work with Zapier. And I was like, heck fetching, yes. So I spent 2 to 3 hours studying out which service I would like to use. I hopped between Make and Zapier and ended up using Zapier because it worked with Buffer, which was way cheaper than paying for the Twitter API. And even though Make would let me interact directly with Twitter and actually watch tweets and respond to them and retweet them. So in the future, I might end up using Make just because I can respond to tweets. And that's something that I kind of want to do in the long run. Between different pages that I have is have my main account retweet actions that my different pages do. So I have a game called Dadbod that has its own Twitter account. If I want to retweet, I would need to watch the tweet. And that's not something that I can do right now on Zapier. But Make can do that. And so I'd likely build that automation in Make. So that's looking for an automator. And the main thing you're going to be looking for is, does this automator integrate with the services I need? AKA, does it have the triggers I need? Does it have the ability to query the sources that I need? Can I, like, for example, can I interact with ChatGPT? Does it have the targets I need? So I needed Twitter. Zapier didn't have Twitter, so I hopped over to Make. Make was like, you need to pay for the Twitter API. I was like, I don't want to do that. So I hopped back. I started looking for other services that would let me do that, and I found Buffer, which does work with Zapier, and so I ended up working with Zapier, right? So using our triggers, sources, and targets, we can effectively choose an automator that fulfills all of our needs. And that's why we started with our triggers, sources, and targets. So once we found an automator, our next step is build it and test it and give it a name. So build and test is, I mean, we're ready for the doing. Once we have our trigger, sources, targets, once we have our automator, we know where we're going to build it. Now we build it, right? And specifically, there are a couple of rules when we're building to ensure that we can come back to it and update it at a later date if it breaks or if there's issues or we want to add to it. So first rule is, if possible, we want to add a description for the automation. Every single automation should have as clearly and concise of a description as possible. I added this yesterday because yesterday Zapier updated their software to allow adding descriptions for a Zap. I was like, finally, that's another thing I wanted you guys to add. So Zapier is really like growing on me. I will say I'm kind of biased towards it just because it is, they are building out a lot of features that I am very fond of. Adding a description to the automation, for me, phenomenal. Fetch and love it. I love those descriptions. So that's thing number one. If you're using Zapier, I don't know if Make allows you to have descriptions for what they call a scenario. It's the equivalent of an automation. But if you can, you should always try to add descriptions. They will save your bacon if you have to come back 6 months, 1 year later and mess with an automation to help you get back up to speed and know what is actually happening. Second, name each step. If every single one of your steps just says, send a message to Discord, buffer, like it just gets confusing, right? And so we want to name each of our steps so that we know what the step is doing. So an example of this, just to show you, and this gets increasingly important when you get more complex automations. So for me, in this case, new Lazada live stream, I have named this buffer step post to Lazada long Twitter, Dadbot campaign, post to Lazada long Twitter, bookends campaign. So each of these has, it's like I can just look at it and I know what it's doing. I don't need to kind of dive into it. I don't need to click on it and look through the details to determine what is this step actually doing. I can just click on it or I don't even need to click on it. I just look and I'm able to follow along. So your good documentation practices, good naming practices will help you and save you in the long run. I promise you, it will save you hours of headache in the long run. Just naming these steps is going to save you those hours. And so I implore you, do it. And I'm going to remove this and say, if possible, I'm going to say optionally, create notes for each step. If a step is very complex, it's valuable to create notes for that step to be like, this is why I'm doing this. So let's say you have a ChatGPT API call and you want to be very explicit about what you are trying to get the AI to generate. You probably want to add notes to that step so that in the future, when you come back to it, you can be like, right, this is what I was trying to get the AI to do. This is why, that's why the prompt that I fed it was this, right? So having notes for the step for complex steps will be very valuable in the long run, right? So these are the rules. You could also call them best practices. And I'd say test each step with personal info. It's like if you can test the step without what I say creating an unresolvable response, you should test it. So unresolvable, I define that as you can't undo the action that the automation took. Sending an email to an account other than yours is an example of an unresolvable action. You cannot unsend that email. It is sent. The person got it. If it wasn't what you wanted to send, too bad. You can't undo it. So being careful about when you're testing to ensure that you're testing with personal info or that you're always performing resolvable actions. AKA you can undo. There's an undo button. I can delete the post on Twitter. I sent the email to myself, so I don't need to worry about it getting to other people, right? We want to test each of our steps so that one, we know the step is actually performing as intended. And actually, that's about it. We just want to know that the step is performing as intended, but we want to test each step with personal info so that we don't create unresolvable actions or responses. These are our rules, aka best practices, when we are building and testing. The last step, that is the name, crucial for organization and, yes, your mental sanity. Like mental sanity is real here. Definitely real. So we have the way that I name things is based on our triggers, sources, targets, right? So the trigger is the first part of the name. Sources, I generally try to list the sources as possible, being, not as specific as I possibly can, but not incredibly verbose. And lastly, I list out the targets I'm trying to execute on. So looking at this one, Twitch, go live. So Twitch is my trigger. Go live is part of the trigger. And then the targets is published to Twitter, Discord, LinkedIn, etc. So this is how I name or try to name all of my actions, all of my automations. So we've got Dream Builders, new user. So when there's a new user in the Dream Builder, that's our trigger. We add the role. Google Docs, we got a new doc and published to Medium. Right? So I try to name them all. It looks like instead of naming them as the trigger, source, target, I have the source, trigger, target. So I kind of flipped those two. I apologize. So the source is Dream Builders. That's where it's starting. We got a new user. We add the role. So this is the way that I name them so that I don't lose my automations. I'm able to see what's happening with just at a glance and have a pretty good idea of their effect. And also in the long term, once I have automations that are triggering other automations, I can see that as well and draw those connections just by looking at the name, which is incredibly useful as your systems get increasingly complex. So that is how we build an automation or prepare ourselves to build an automation and then actually build it. I didn't dive too far into the actual construction of an automation. I really covered more, okay, here's how we prep ourselves with our triggers, sources, targets, find an automator, build, like actually building the test. And I can record additional videos on that to walk through how we would construct a test or construct an automation. And lastly, giving it a name. So this has been a presentation, an intro really to automation and automating your own process.